Irashaimase! Hello and welcome to Fataris' Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fataris. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this Saturday we have Gradius 3, the 1989 arcade classic receiving the Arcade Archive treatment. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. From developer Konami, Gradius 3 would release to arcades in 1989 in Japan and the Asian regions. It would not see release outside of that area until the Super Nintendo port a couple years later. So originally I was not planning on doing a video of this particular release, the Arcade Archive version of Gradius 3, because I had previously covered the Super Nintendo version. However, there was one particular screenshot that made me go, wait, there's a stage like that in the arcade version of Gradius 3? Well, with that in mind, I had to give this one a try. And I'm glad I did, as there's a lot of interesting content in this particular release. That said, I still consider the Super Nintendo version of Gradius 3 to be the superior version, and if you're looking to experience that game, do it that way, not necessarily this way unless you're a fan of the franchise and Konami shooters of this generation. So, with that out of the way, we find ourselves at the Arcade Archive menu, and you can see there are three different ROM versions here. The Japanese old, the Japanese new, which I couldn't really find the difference between those two, and then the Asian version, which is a slightly easier version overall. And then the mode that I feel makes this release altogether, the custom mode. But we'll get to that one in a little bit. First, we'll start on the Japanese version, and starting the game, we have this really neat intro that goes over the history of the franchise from 1985, the original Gradius. Then it also includes Salamanders, of course, included in this, and that's your 1986 release. You've got the Gradius 2 in 88, and then Gradius 3 in 89. So we'll go ahead and jump right to putting the credits in there and start the game itself, which, whoops, wrong button, which takes us to this screen here. In the Japanese version, you can select your difficulty. There's two. There's the technical, which is the normal difficulty, or the beginner, but in beginner you can only play up through stage 3. Once you've selected your difficulty, you're taken to the weapon select. And this is, of course, one of the things I love the most about the Gradius franchise, after the first one, is selecting the different weapon types you can take. So you can choose from A, B, C, or D, which gives you different selections of missiles, double, or laser, or you can go to the edit mode, where you can select different missiles. And these options here are different than the ones you would get in the other mode. So we'll select control-like missile, because that's an interesting one to have a look at. The spread double, which we probably won't see. And then my favorite laser is the twin laser, because it provides a different, a lot of coverage, but there's also the really fascinating E-laser, which also happens to be present in the Super Nintendo version. Two options, the main option or the S option, I do prefer the original, and we have a couple shields as well, force field, shield, free shield, and reduce. Free shield's interesting because it basically has you glue the, not really glue, but that's kind of a fun way to look at it, glue the shields to what part of the ship you want it to defend. So, Gradius, if you're not familiar with it, is your typical horizontal scrolling shoot 'em up, where one of the main mechanics is collecting these orange power-ups. Those power-ups will move our options on that bar on the bottom. Once we get to a certain particular power-up option we want, we press a button and it activates that power-up. So at this point, I've selected two power-ups. I've selected the missile as well as the option. So the option, or, well, the sound clip calls it multiple, but it's written as option, so you can really go either way. Just gives you an extra gun pod that follows your ship around, providing additional firepower in both your missiles as well as your main shot. The missile itself, so this is the controlled missile, and this is not in the Super Nintendo version. And it's one that I consider really interesting if difficult to use. So as the name implies, you control it directly. Your movements, if you move up or down, it controls what direction the laser, or rather the missile itself goes. Move up, the missile goes up, move down, the missile goes down. So it's actually possible to even use some really interesting like wavy patterns to kind of control and use it to provide a lot of area control on the screen. So we're seeing kind of one of what I've called in the past the Gradius power down syndrome. So you get built up to a certain point, but if you die, and especially if you die in the wrong area, it can be very, very difficult to get going again, as your power-ups are reduced to 0. This is one area where the Asian version is superior, as it does not do that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that, when I do get to that variant. But so the stages between the Super Nintendo version and the arcade version are not quite the same. In some ways they look better on the arcade version, in some ways they look better on the Super Nintendo version, and you've got some differences in number of stages as well as stage layout. Some stages were in the arcade version are removed in the Super Nintendo version, and there were a lot of like added stages. So you can kind of see a little bit of the idea of what's going on here in the first stage. So let's go ahead and show some of the options that are present in the game itself. So under game settings, you can see that we've got the ability to set our number of lives as well as the difficulty. So this is pretty typical stuff if you've looked on the menus on any of Hamster's Arcade Archive releases. There's also this fun preference settings, and here there are all these little settings you can turn on or off to recreate certain behaviors from the original arcade experience, making it as pure of an arcade experience as possible. One thing that is really neat, so the laser, if you turn on rapid fire, the laser would not function properly with rapid fire turned on. It's possible to turn it off with this setting. So by default the setting is actually off, so if you turn on the rapid fire, it's not used when you're equipped with the laser, and I really appreciate that. It's great to have those kind of extra options for both arcade perfect ports, as well as some additional quality of life settings. So I really appreciate the ones that are in the arcade settings. And of course, being able to change your buttons. The manual is really useful, as well as it does give a pretty good description of all the weapons that you can select in the manual. So if you're interested in that, definitely check that out. Going back to the title screen, though, I want to show off custom mode, as it's one of the things that I really, really love about this particular release. So in custom mode, you can select your version. Japanese new, Japanese old, or the Asian version. And then there's this neat little option to turn on or off this hunter timer. So the hunters, if you are familiar with the series, if you have a full collection of options, these option hunters will show up to steal your options, and they suck. But apparently there's a timer that controls when they show up, and this option allows you to set it to the max. So you can also say which loop you want the game to be on, so that'll increase your difficulty. Once you complete the game, it starts on another loop, and the difficulty ramps up. Doesn't really need that, as it's already hard as hell anyway, but... And then you can select where you want the game to begin, on which stage, as well as which checkpoint. And for that, I want to specifically show off this, because it's a stage that does not exist in the Super Nintendo release of Gradius 3. So the Asian version doesn't have the history, it just goes straight to the 1989 and starts with the title screen. Starting the game, the weapon selection, everything are the same. Rather than go to edit, we'll just pick D, which happens to be my favorite of the defaults for Gradius 3. And you can pick your shield type. We'll of course go with A and move on. So this stage is kind of a bonus stage, and it's super fascinating, as rather than have any firing or shots or anything going on, we're just traveling through this lightning fast tunnel. and it kind of acts as this like bonus stage, as we can pick up power-ups and kind of build up our ship while we're doing this section. It's actually, once you've done it a couple times and you kind of like get the feel for how to move through the stage, it's not particularly difficult, but I'm not doing very well at it here. It does come a certain point when it just gets to be a little bit too much for the arcade hardware itself, and we end up with a lot of slowdown. One thing that you might have noticed is at the bottom of the screen, as I'm picking up power-ups, those power-ups are accumulating. And another thing that the Asian version does different from the Japanese version is you don't lose your placement on the power-up bar between lives. For the Japanese version, it's not possible to have more than, or rather to carry over one power-up between lives. If you die with like 4 power-ups and you're on option, you'll start with just defaulted back to speed, which is useful because you really need a little bit of speed at the beginning of any Gradius stages. Base speed is really not enough to dodge the enemy shots and the enemies in most situations. So past that fork, I'm assuming it's just because there's too much being drawn on either side of the screen, but you get a lot of slowdown going on, and it's significantly easier to finish this section. And bam! Once you complete it, we're dropped right into the next stage, and here we can start showing off some of the other awesome features of the custom mode. So in custom mode, it's possible to play around with this mode, which turns on the enemy hitboxes. Really neat if you're looking to practice. In addition to turning on the hitboxes, we have the ability to turn on the hitboxes on our shots as well. So we can see exactly the hitboxes of our shots as well as the enemy shots. I consider that great from a training standpoint, as you can really get a good grip of how close we can skim enemy bullets, shots, etc. In addition to that, though, there's also this neat ability, which basically acts as, let's turn off the hitboxes on our shot so we can see things a little bit clearer, which basically gives us full power. It kind of acts as almost like the Konami code in the Super Nintendo version of Gradius 3. Of course, this being the arcade version, that code is not present. So this stage, unfortunately, well, really, all of Gradius 3 is brutally hard. But the stage should give us the option of showing off how at least the Asian version is a little bit easier. I mentioned you don't lose your power-up bar placement when you die. Another thing you don't lose is it doesn't suffer 100% from the power down syndrome that base Gradius 3 does. The Asian version, when you die, it basically is removing the topmost power-up, or rather the furthest rightmost power-up from your options, and then kind of like leaves you in really a decent spot. So of course you're not going to have the force field when you come back, but you, in the case of right now, we would lose our options. But we'd still have our missiles, we'd still have our lasers, and we would still have our speed, allowing us to far more easily come back from that loss of life and make it that much further in the game. There is an issue with that, though. It's like I'm so used to the way that default Gradius 3 does it, I want to always pick speed at the first time, and we already have speed, so we don't need any additional speed, and I end up getting just too fast. It makes it difficult to get through sections. This particular checkpoint in this stage is like really terrible in my mind, as it just kind of like leaves you right next to a rock wall. So if you happen to move down in any way, you're dead. Just like, that's just mean developers. So at any rate, that's basically the custom mode, and I love it from the perspective of training for this super, super difficult game. We ended up losing game over. And of course, another thing that Gradius 3 does not have, it does not have the ability to continue. Once you run out of lives, it's game over no matter how many credits are in the machine. It never gives you the chance to continue, and that's another thing that the Super Nintendo version does that does make it superior to this version. So there you have it. Gradius 3 Arcade Archive served up for your enjoyment. Starting the game in custom mode, it'll once again start on the stage that you have selected, so we'll always start on this particular bonus stage until we go back to the menu and change those settings. What do we have as far as minus flavors are concerned? Well, this is the game itself. Gradius 3, the arcade version, is comically difficult. There's just too many sections where it's like, what in the heck were they expecting, and why did they want to eat everybody's quarters or 100 yen coins so badly? I mean, you know why, obviously. It's a ploy to make money, but they made the title far too difficult. Then in addition to that, as part of the being too difficult, the lack of continues, just why? Why be that brutal about it? If somebody wants to show off a one continue clear, there are ways to do that. Do that with a score and putting a 1 at the end for every single time that you've reached a continue. But on the plus versions, I do appreciate, or the plus flavors, I do really appreciate the inclusion of the 3 different ROMs, and especially this custom mode, so you can experience all the stages that Gradius 3 Arcade has to offer, even if you can't get to them through normal means because the game is just outright unfair. Then there's also the wonderful weapon selection that Gradius 3 has. I really appreciate the weapon edit as well as the different weapon types we can select. And also my last plus flavor is I just love Gradius 3 for its art, just the sprite work and design, as well as the music that's present in the game. It's nostalgic for me, even if the game itself, I feel, hasn't aged as well as other shoot-'em-ups from the era. And that's just more or less a difficulty feeling to me. I just don't like that the game itself just feels brutal. Oh, there's an option hunter. He's gonna try and steal one of my options. Can we avoid him? We can't. Oh no, he got one. Never mind. Well, at any rate, there we go. That'll just about wrap it up for this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. First off, I want to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode, and this happens to be the first episode of 2021 as well, so thank you for joining me for yet another year. I hope we'll continue to see each other throughout the course of the year. And as always, I want to say thank you so much for stopping by, and we'll see you next week.